He had seen men operate in jungles all over the world, from the dense canopies of Central America to the unforgiving terrains of the Philippines and Korea. But what the colonel witnessed in the green hell of Phuoc Tuy province in 1968 was an entirely different doctrine of warfare. He was a veteran then, with 23 years in uniform. He had trained rangers, led elite reconnaissance units, and thought he understood every possible way a professional soldier could move through hostile territory. Then he met the Australian Special Air Service Regiment. The request came through official channels quietly, suggesting it would be valuable for senior American officers to observe Allied methods. They called it a professional exchange, operating out of the Nui Dat base. The colonel expected competence, given the solid reputation of the Australians, but he also expected a profound familiarity in their procedures. He operated under the assumption that all professional soldiers learned from the same fundamental tactical manuals. He assumed they would rely on aggressive movement and firepower to dominate the battle space. He was fundamentally wrong about that. The patrol leader met him at the perimeter wire just before dawn. There was absolutely no ceremony, no formal intelligence briefing, and no grand speeches about the mission ahead. The Australian offered just a brief nod, a firm handshake, and a quietly muttered question. "You right to move, sir?" 6 men stood ready in the pre-dawn gloom. They carried exceptionally light packs, designed to minimize fatigue and mechanical noise. They applied green and black camouflage paint to their faces in total, absolute silence. Around them, the American and conventional base clattered with the heavy, metallic morning routine of a standard infantry unit preparing for war. Engines roared, mess hall equipment clanked, and non-commissioned officers shouted orders over the din. The contrast between this mechanical beast and the waiting SAS patrol was immediate and striking. The colonel had personally commanded dozens of combat patrols and overseen hundreds of search and destroy operations. He intimately knew what conventional, firepower-heavy soldiering looked like. But something about the psychological posture of these Allied men felt fundamentally different. The primary difference lay in the severe economy of their physical movements. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary shifting of weight, and absolutely no extraneous words spoken. They stepped off the wire at 05:30 hours, exactly. The dense jungle swallowed their entire formation in less than 30 meters. What struck the colonel first was not the tactical maneuvers they executed, but rather the actions they deliberately avoided. They did not talk or whisper. They did not crack dark jokes to ease the pre-combat psychological tension. American soldiers often relied on banter to cope with the immense stress of stepping into hostile territory. Furthermore, the Australians did not move with that characteristic infantry urgency that loudly communicated they had vast ground to cover and geographical objectives to physically secure. Instead, they just flowed forward like water, finding its natural path through a field of scattered stones. The patrol leader suddenly halted the formation after advancing maybe 200 meters. He gave no standard hand signal that the veteran American colonel could immediately recognize or interpret. The entire 6-man patrol simply stopped in unison, as if connected by a shared neurological wire. Frozen in place, the colonel immediately halted too, carefully watching the men and waiting for a standard tactical sign that would indicate what threat they had detected. No such signal came from the front. They stood there in the suffocating humidity for 3 minutes, maybe 4, just intently listening to the environment. The colonel strained his own ears, desperately trying to perceive whatever auditory anomaly had triggered this sudden defensive posture. He heard the chaotic symphony of morning bird calls, the relentless buzzing of indigenous insects, and the subtle whisper of wind pushing through the upper canopy. He detected absolutely nothing that suggested an imminent human threat or an enemy ambush. Then, without any visible prompting, they smoothly resumed their forward movement. There was no whispered explanation, no quick tactical debrief passed down the line. They had heard something concerning. Or perhaps they had failed to hear an ambient sound they naturally expected to hear in an undisturbed ecological zone. Either way, they had internally adjusted, processed the sensory information, and made a collective operational decision entirely in silence. The colonel immediately began taking extensive mental notes on this friction-free communication. The American patrols he had trained and led for over 2 decades possessed a distinct rhythm and an aggressive pace. In the American doctrine, you covered physical ground quickly. You violently secured geographic objectives. Time mattered immensely, and rigid mission timelines dictated the operational tempo. There was always a specific grid coordinate to reach and a strict schedule to maintain. The Australian SASR clearly operated on an entirely different tactical clock. They would slowly move 50 meters and then completely halt to listen and observe. One man would meticulously study the muddy ground for tripwires and tracks, while another intensely scanned the dense upper canopy for concealed snipers or enemy observers. Nothing was rushed, and no movement was violently forced through the thick undergrowth. Each physical step was calculated, deliberately considered, and highly purposeful. Around mid-morning, the lead point man suddenly raised a clenched fist, freezing the patrol again. The colonel could not physically see what the point man saw, nor could he hear what the scout had heard. The claustrophobic jungle looked exactly the same in every possible direction. It was a suffocating wall of thick vegetation, dappled tropical sunlight, and the endless, oppressive green that had violently swallowed so many young men in this brutal conflict. For 7 agonizing minutes, the entire Australian patrol did not move a single solitary muscle. The colonel quietly watched a heavy bead of sweat slowly roll down the patrol leader's face. The stoic Australian did not raise a hand to wipe the stinging sweat away. He did not blink excessively, nor did he shift his significant pack weight to ease his burdened shoulders. He just stood there like a statue, his weapon held at the ready, his eyes methodically scanning the foliage, listening intently to a subtle disturbance the American officer could not perceive. This was the raw, unglamorous reality of long-range reconnaissance. Finally, the point man carefully took 2 calculated steps to his left, deliberately moving off the natural trail. The rest of the patrol smoothly followed his exact path in a tight single file, taking exceptionally careful steps. Each soldier placed his heavy boots precisely in the compressed footprint, where the man directly before him had just stepped, leaving a single track. 100 meters later, the colonel finally understood the reason for this extreme caution. There were distinct, deep boot prints pressed into the soft mud right where they would have naturally walked. These were recent tactical prints, judging by the moisture, perhaps only an hour old. It was a North Vietnamese army unit moving south along what had probably seemed like a perfectly natural transit route through the punishing terrain. The SAS point man had somehow known. He had sensed a critical, tactical anomaly before seeing any concrete physical evidence. Perhaps they had smelled the distinct scent of stale human sweat, which carries differently than the natural odor of jungle rot. Perhaps they had heard a sudden unnatural absence in the bird calls, serving as an ecological alarm that clearly spoke of recent, heavy human passage. Perhaps they had simply noticed the way the morning shadows fell incorrectly across a bruised fern, indicating the local vegetation had been violently disturbed. The veteran colonel still could not definitively say which specific human sense had alerted them to the friction ahead. But they had known, and they had trusted that collective fieldcraft enough to instantly alter their patrol route without a single question, without any debate, and without needing to see hard proof first. That was when he truly began to realize how much he did not know. The psychological discipline required to maintain this level of sensory awareness was staggering. An infantryman in a large formation relies on the sheer volume of surrounding guns for a profound sense of psychological security. In stark contrast, these 6 men relied exclusively on their absolute invisibility and their mastery of the environment. Every single decision they made was firmly rooted in a cold, calculating calculus of risk versus intelligence value. If the enemy did not know you were there, you inherently controlled the overarching tempo of the impending tactical engagement. This methodology represented a harsh departure from the heavily armed search and destroy missions the colonel normally orchestrated. Those conventional operations often treated the unforgiving jungle as a hostile enemy to be violently conquered with overwhelming firepower and sheer manpower. The Australian doctrine, however, treated the dense green hell as an impartial, complex language to be carefully deciphered. They did not fight the terrain, they weaponized it. They understood that the dense foliage provided just as much lethal concealment for a patient hunter as it did for the hunted prey. As the morning heat intensified, the heavy humidity began to violently assault the human body. The physical toll of carrying specialized equipment, excess ammunition, and heavy radios while moving with agonizing slowness was severe. Yet, the respiratory rates of the SASR operators remained incredibly controlled. There was no heavy panting, no desperate gasping for the thick, stagnant tropical air. They had rigorously trained their bodies to consume oxygen efficiently under extreme physical and psychological duress. This physical conditioning prevented the loud, involuntary biological noises that frequently compromised lesser military units. The colonel forced his own breathing to slow down, mimicking their practiced, deliberate respiratory cadence. He acutely felt the heavy combat webbing cutting viciously into his tired shoulders, the raw friction of damp canvas against his sweat-soaked uniform. He consciously embraced the physical pain, recognizing it as an inescapable element of this specialized warfare. He was participating in a masterclass of long-range patrolling, learning the bitter truth that true lethality was not always measured by the caliber of a weapon, but by the disciplined silence of the man carrying it. They continued their ghost-like progression deeper into the contested territory, slipping quietly between the towering mahogany trees and the dense thickets of thorned bamboo. The imaginary safety wire of the American base was now miles behind them, both geographically and philosophically. They were completely isolated, fully reliant on their specialized fieldcraft, and deeply immersed in a high-stakes game of sensory detection. The veteran colonel wiped the stinging sweat from his tired eyes and silently followed the muddy boots of the man in front of him, ready for the next brutal lesson. They harbored up during the most oppressive part of the afternoon heat. Even their prescribed rest was heavily disciplined, lacking any of the casual relaxation typical of regular infantry units. These men did not cluster together to share cigarettes or complain about the suffocating humidity. Each individual soldier assumed a specific arc of responsibility, maintaining a 360-degree defensive posture without needing to be told. No one broke their silhouette against the skyline or the lighter gaps in the canopy. They remained perfectly motionless, blending seamlessly into the decaying vegetation and the deep jungle shadows around them. The simplest human actions required intense concentration and strict tactical discipline to avoid creating fatal friction. They drank their tepid water without making a single sound, tilting their plastic canteens agonizingly slowly. Every swallow was meticulously controlled, so the remaining water would not slosh loudly inside the container and betray their concealed position. The colonel watched this agonizing process, realizing how easily a momentary lapse in basic discipline could result in a catastrophic ambush. In this unforgiving environment, a simple metallic clink or a careless cough was equivalent to firing a flare into the dark sky. The Australian patrol leader silently glided over to the dense thicket where the American colonel sat concealed. He spoke in a raspy whisper that barely carried 3 feet through the heavy, humid air, even though the nearest human beings were likely miles away. "Notice the butterflies, sir?" The colonel had not noticed them at all, but now that the seasoned Australian specifically mentioned it, he saw them clearly. There were dozens of delicate, yellow, and black insects, fluttering peacefully in a rare patch of unbroken sunlight about 20 meters away, dancing effortlessly between the massive green leaves. "They are feeding right now," the patrol leader calmly stated in his barely audible whisper, which means absolutely no one has walked through that specific sector recently. Nature constantly tells you crucial things if you simply take the time to listen and observe. It was a seemingly microscopic detail, but it was a vital piece of intelligence. The colonel had never been taught in any formal military school or standard training manual. This was hard-earned knowledge, forged in the unforgiving crucible of the field, learned over grueling years through bitter experience, blood, and hypervigilant observation. This pragmatic wisdom was passed down from veteran to rookie in quiet whispers and leading by example, rarely written in rigid tactical doctrine or taught in sterile classrooms. The American colonel had graduated from prestigious staff colleges, had instructed eager young lieutenants at Fort Benning, and had even authored training materials utilized throughout the conventional army. Yet, here he was, sitting in the humid mud, having a rugged Australian sergeant teach him how to effectively read the hostile jungle through the undisturbed flight patterns of local butterflies. It completely dismantled his preconceived notions of military intelligence gathering. He carefully thought about the numerous combat patrols he had personally led over the past 2 decades. He had commanded good, brave men who always moved with clear aggression and destructive purpose. American doctrine dictated that you aggressively dominated the surrounding terrain through sheer force and intimidation. They brought overwhelming firepower to the battlefield and utilized it with devastating effect whenever they made contact with the enemy. However, the Australian Special Air Service Regiment brought something entirely different to this green hell. They brought an unnerving, calculating patience that completely defied conventional military logic and established operational timelines. They brought acute observation and a profound willingness to let the enemy accidentally reveal himself rather than forcing a violent kinetic contact through aggressive, noisy movement. Later that sweltering afternoon, they clearly heard the distinct, rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotor blades echoing in the far distance. They were undeniably American aircraft, likely a flight of UH-1 Hueys, probably inserting or frantically extracting a conventional infantry unit somewhere to the east. The heavy mechanical noise carried for many miles through the otherwise pristine jungle canopy, instantly announcing a massive foreign presence to anyone within a massive geographic radius. It was the distinctive, mechanical heartbeat of the American war machine that every single soldier and combatant in Vietnam intimately recognized. Hearing the distant roar, the SASR patrol leader shook his head very slightly. It was not a gesture of arrogant judgment or superiority, but simply a cold, objective tactical observation. It was a remarkably subtle movement that spoke absolute volumes about their differing operational philosophies. "Charlie knows exactly where they are right now," the Australian whispered softly, "knows precisely where they have been, and certainly knows the exact direction they are currently heading toward." He noted that the enemy forces were probably already shifting their defensive positions to actively avoid the incoming Americans, or perhaps methodically setting up lethal ambushes along their projected infiltration routes. This assessment was not a harsh criticism of standard American operational methods, but just a brutal statement of tactical reality in this specific kind of asymmetrical jungle warfare. The American military undeniably possessed massive logistical advantages that the small Australian contingents simply did not have. They boasted unparalleled aerial mobility, devastating artillery firepower, and immediate medevac capabilities that could extract wounded men within mere minutes. However, those overwhelming logistical advantages came with severe tactical costs, primarily regarding extreme mechanical noise, massive visual signatures, and the enemy's total foreknowledge of their presence and strategic intentions. The SASR operators fundamentally functioned on a completely different operational principle. If the heavily armed enemy does not even know you are standing right there, you have already successfully won more than half of the impending battle. An actively avoided combat contact is often vastly more valuable to the overall strategic picture than a violent, chaotic firefight won through the massive expenditure of blood and expensive artillery shells. Critical intelligence gathered quietly and cleanly is perpetually worth significantly more than heavily fortified ground taken loudly and messily. These foundational concepts were simply not lessons widely taught in conventional American military doctrine during that specific era. American fighting forces were structurally built entirely around massive firepower and rapid mobility, heavily relying on their inherent ability to forcefully locate the elusive enemy and utterly destroy him with an overwhelming application of kinetic force. It was an industrial approach to warfare that had successfully worked in previous global conflicts across Europe and the sprawling islands of the Pacific. But here, suffocating inside this impossibly dense jungle against a highly motivated and deeply entrenched indigenous enemy, the veteran colonel was finally beginning to clearly see the fatal limitations of that heavy-handed approach. Late in the stifling afternoon brought the first truly terrifying test of the long day. They were silently navigating through a nightmare of thick secondary growth vegetation. This specific type of punishing terrain severely limited human visibility to maybe 10 meters in any given direction. It was exactly the kind of claustrophobic environment that made enemy ambushes incredibly easy to execute and nearly impossible to survive. The lead point man suddenly halted mid-stride, his right fist shooting straight up into the humid air. Without a single word or hesitation, Everyone in the patrol instantly dropped down into the wet mud. The American colonel immediately went prone alongside them, relying on muscle memory ingrained from decades of rigorous infantry training taking over his conscious thought. He pressed his face deeply into the rotting leaves, feeling the sudden, terrifying spike of adrenaline flooding his nervous system. Somewhere out there in the suffocating green wall, a lethal threat was rapidly approaching their concealed position in the secondary growth. He watched the Australian patrol leader intensely, trying to read what was happening through subtle shifts in body language. The seasoned operator had moved his head only slightly, carefully triangulating an approaching auditory anomaly. His hand came up with agonizing slowness, extending 2 fingers pointing directly to the left flank. Then he made a specific hand motion the American colonel did not initially recognize, walking his fingers slowly across his open palm. The silent message passed seamlessly back through the prone patrol. Each man received the critical intelligence, acknowledged it without making a single sound, and mentally prepared. An enemy combat patrol was currently moving parallel to their concealed position, perhaps only 30 meters away through the dense, unforgiving scrub. The colonel could distinctly hear them now, the undeniable sound of Vietnamese voices speaking in low, careful tones. They were moving tactically too, clearly attempting to maintain operational noise discipline, but they were still talking. They used hushed words to coordinate their physical movements, whereas the Australian SASer exclusively utilized absolute silence and complex hand signals. For 20 agonizing minutes, these 2 heavily armed patrols moved in a terrifying, perfectly parallel trajectory through the claustrophobic green wall. Those 20 minutes represented an excruciating window where any wrong sound, any careless shift of a combat boot, could have instantly triggered a devastating firefight. At point-blank range in such incredibly dense jungle, massive firepower becomes a chaotic liability rather than a calculated advantage. It would be the specific kind of frantic, close-quarter slaughter where everybody bleeds and absolutely nobody wins a strategic victory. Lying flat against the damp earth, the colonel carefully counted 8 distinct enemy voices, possibly 9. It was a full squad-sized element, perhaps slightly more, navigating the same treacherous secondary growth just meters away. They were heavily armed, judging by the unmistakable metallic sounds of shifting equipment and rifles occasionally bumping against the rigid bamboo stalks. These enemy soldiers were clearly experienced veterans too, moving with measured caution and maintaining respectable tactical spacing between their individual elements. However, their fundamental lack of absolute noise discipline created a fatal vulnerability that the silent Australians were ruthlessly exploiting. The SASR operators simply did not move a single muscle, refusing to even breathe loudly. The American colonel felt a torrent of hot sweat running violently down his spine, pooling uncomfortably at his heavy equipment belt. His aging legs began to cramp severely from holding the unnatural, rigid prone position on the uneven jungle floor. Every screaming nerve in his body desperately wanted to shift, to subtly adjust his weight, to ease the intense burning sensation building rapidly in his knees. The seasoned Australians remained as motionless as carved statues, displaying a terrifying level of physical control. Not even their eyes moved unnecessarily, keeping their visual focus locked precisely within their designated defensive sectors. They had instinctively found firing positions that offered maximum concealment, entirely breaking up their human silhouettes in the dappled shadows. These concealed positions made them practically invisible against the chaotic backdrop of the rotting jungle floor and tangled vegetation. The enemy patrol slowly passed by their static location, entirely oblivious to the lethal force lying just a few dozen feet away. The foreign voices gradually faded toward the northern sector, slowly dissolving into the persistent ambient noise of the surrounding environment. Normal jungle sounds slowly returned, including routine bird calls, the steady humming of insects, and the rustle of the wind. Yet, the Australian patrol leader did not immediately signal the all-clear for his men to relax. They waited in absolute, rigid silence for another 20 excruciating minutes after the enemy voices had completely disappeared from auditory range. Nobody dared to move a single millimeter, and nobody relaxed their defensive posture. They waited to be absolutely certain, ensuring the armed enemy squad had moved far enough away that any slight rustling from their own extraction would not carry through the humid air. They refused to alert the North Vietnamese soldiers to the deadly presence they had just unknowingly bypassed. Finally, the Australian patrol leader gave the subtle physical signal to initiate a cautious tactical withdrawal. They extracted quietly from the immediate danger zone, moving at a sharp oblique angle away from both the enemy's projected route and their own previous path. This calculated maneuver aggressively created necessary physical distance, successfully breaking a tactical contact that had never fully escalated into a kinetic engagement. The SASR could have easily ambushed that specific enemy formation from their concealed positions. 6 highly trained men against 8 or 9, armed with the vital element of total surprise and ruthless fire discipline, would have resulted in a remarkably swift and violently decisive close-range tactical slaughter. It would have been precisely the kind of aggressive tactical action that routinely generated glowing after-action reports within standard American infantry battalions. Such an engagement would guarantee medals for bravery and significantly contribute to the macabre statistical body count that seemingly mattered so much to the high command in this controversial war. But they deliberately chose not to pull their triggers. The Australian patrol leader caught the American colonel's eye as they slowly moved away, offering the absolute smallest, barely perceptible shake of his camouflaged head. Not our primary mission, his cold, stoic expression clearly communicated. Their true mission was strategic intelligence gathering, deep long-range reconnaissance, and meticulously learning the enemy's operational patterns without actively disturbing them. In this specific context, successfully avoiding a violent kinetic contact was not a sign of tactical failure or cowardice. It was the ultimate manifestation of operational success and supreme professional discipline. It was the entire strategic point of their lonely existence in this unforgiving green hell. That was the exact moment when the veteran colonel truly began to comprehend the immense depth of the specialized warfare he was currently observing firsthand in the muddy jungle. This was not simply a slightly different doctrinal method of executing the exact same infantry tasks he had taught for decades. This was an entirely different species of warfare, functioning on completely alien psychological and tactical principles. Evening eventually brought strict harbor procedures that the seasoned colonel had never witnessed in any American unit. The Australian operators did not aggressively dig defensive trenches or establish a conventional perimeter utilizing interlocking fields of heavy machine gun fire. Instead, they painstakingly sought out a geographic position that was practically invisible, prioritizing total operational concealment over conventional kinetic defensive strength. One dedicated operator meticulously covered their physical back trail, carefully erasing any subtle signs of their recent passage through the vegetation. He did not attempt to erase it perfectly, as that obsessive effort would take far too long and inherently draw unwanted attention to the specific location. He did just enough to deceive a casual tracker. A broken branch was carefully repositioned to hide where it had been snapped, and dead leaves were redistributed to mask fresh boot prints. A distinct scuff mark in the damp moss was gently smoothed over with a highly practiced, careful hand. They consumed their cold, unappetizing military rations in total silence, avoiding any metallic scraping of utensils against metal tins. There was absolutely no artificial heating involved, meaning no hot meals, no small chemical fires, and no burning tabs that might suddenly produce an unnatural smell or a visible thermal signature. Everything they brought into the jungle meticulously went back out inside their heavy canvas rucksacks. There was zero trash left behind, leaving absolutely no physical evidence or subtle ecological sign that 6 heavily armed men had recently occupied this specific patch of the contested Vietnamese jungle. As absolute darkness finally fell, the dense jungle instantly came alive with a chaotic symphony of nocturnal activity. Millions of insects emerged in massive, rhythmic waves, their collective calls rising and falling in hypnotic patterns that the veteran colonel had previously learned to sleep through. Exotic birds aggressively settled into the high canopy for the long night, while other nocturnal hunters silently emerged from their hidden dens. Something incredibly massive occasionally crashed through the thick upper branches above them. It was perhaps a troop of heavy monkeys, or potentially something far more dangerous moving blindly through the trees. The Australian SASR operators intensely listened to every single element of this chaotic biological noise, meticulously cataloging each distinct sound. They fundamentally understood what constituted normal ecological behavior and what represented a lethal anomaly. They were actively learning the specific acoustic language of this particular piece of contested jungle so they would know instantly if something human violently disturbed the natural pattern. The darkness in that dense tropical jungle was absolute and suffocating. Absolutely no moonlight successfully penetrated the triple canopy overhead, and no ambient starlight ever reached the rotting ground where the men lay perfectly still. The seasoned American colonel could not even see his own trembling hand when he held it inches in front of his face. He had experienced profound darkness before, during his lengthy career, but this sensory deprivation was entirely different. This was a terrifying, primordial darkness, the specific kind that instinctively makes grown men remember their evolutionary status as both apex predators and vulnerable prey. Yet, the Australian operators were exceptionally comfortable operating within this suffocating black void. They established a rotating watch schedule, utilizing staggered shifts that the disoriented American officer could not quite comprehend or track. It eerily seemed as though every single member of the patrol was always partially awake and hyper-aware of their immediate surroundings. Absolutely no one snored, and no one shifted their cramped physical positions carelessly against the dry leaves. They had successfully mastered the incredibly difficult martial art of sleeping while remaining completely alert, resting their exhausted bodies while staying tactically ready for sudden violence. Around midnight, the shivering colonel finally heard the terrifying anomaly. It was a highly unnatural sound that absolutely did not fit the established biological pattern of the dark jungle environment around them. It was the distinct noise of hard metal scraping against metal, incredibly soft but terrifyingly distinct in the quiet night. The source was perhaps 200 meters away, maybe considerably more, as judging physical distance in this absolute darkness was practically impossible. The Australian patrol leader was positioned right next to him instantly, his firm hand pressing down hard on the colonel's shoulder. He was physically steadying the older man, clearly communicating his tactical intent entirely without speaking words. "Be absolutely still. Just listen carefully to the darkness. We already know they are out there moving." They intensely listened together in the blackness. The colonel narrowed his focus exclusively on the faint sound, desperately trying to specifically identify it and locate its exact geographical origin. Metal striking metal definitively meant human presence, and it almost certainly indicated heavy military equipment. It was probably plastic canteens heavily bumping against steel rifle receivers or canvas magazine pouches, awkwardly shifting against brass belt buckles. These were the tiny, involuntary acoustic signatures that heavily armed soldiers inevitably make, even when they are desperately trying to be quiet. The terrifying sound faintly came again, slowly moving away. It was undoubtedly an enemy infantry patrol, aggressively utilizing the cover of night to tactically reposition their combat forces. The North Vietnamese army frequently took maximum advantage of the darkness, precisely because they knew the Americans completely owned the daylight hours with overwhelming air power and devastating artillery. Despite the extreme proximity of the hostile force, the SASR operators did absolutely nothing. They did not physically react, and they deliberately did not prepare their suppressed weapons to violently engage the passing threat. They merely listened quietly, accurately tracking the acoustic movement patterns in their disciplined minds. Day 6 of the grueling patrol finally brought a specific, high-stakes operational purpose to all their previous observation and silent movement. The elite team had been meticulously tracking these hidden enemy supply routes for nearly a full week, carefully building a complex intelligence pattern of hostile logistical activity. Now, the distant Allied headquarters urgently wanted them to visually confirm a highly suspected enemy staging area deep in the sector. This was an isolated geographical location where heavy munitions and vital supplies were allegedly being actively cached before moving forward to frontline combat units engaging American forces. This terrifying assignment was not mere optical observation from a comfortable, safe distance using powerful binoculars. This specific mission required conducting incredibly dangerous close reconnaissance, demanding that human operators get near enough to physically count wooden boxes. They needed to positively identify distinct supply types and accurately map the defensive trench positions of the sprawling logistical hub. It was the exact kind of high-risk tactical infiltration that could go catastrophically wrong very quickly if a single dry twig snapped. They initiated their agonizingly slow infiltration maneuver under the total concealment of the dark, suffocating jungle night. Their tactical movement was exponentially slower than the veteran colonel had ever thought physically possible for heavily burdened infantrymen. Each agonizing forward step was gently tested against the uneven earth before any significant body weight was carefully shifted forward. They had to blindly feel the dark ground for hidden tripwires, locate a completely solid patch of mud, and slowly roll the combat boot forward. Then they tested the soil again, shifting their heavy canvas rucksacks gradually to avoid any sudden noisy fabric friction. There was absolutely no sound permitted, no careless stumbling, and no snapping of branches. It took 3 agonizingly long hours of this disciplined movement to cover a geographical distance of less than a single kilometer. 3 continuous hours of maintaining this excruciatingly slow kinetic pace effectively transformed basic infantry movement into a painful form of dark meditation. The aging colonel's leg muscles burned with a violent, acidic intensity that he had rarely experienced in his long career. His lower back ached fiercely from the unnatural posture, and hot sweat completely soaked his heavy combat uniform, despite the slightly cooler ambient temperature of the pitch-black tropical night surrounding their isolated team. But their extreme physical suffering yielded a massive tactical advantage, allowing them to finally arrive completely undetected at the objective. As the gray dawn slowly approached, filtering weakly through the thick canopy, they found themselves positioned perfectly. They lay concealed in the dense undergrowth, merely 50 meters from a massive, heavily fortified jungle clearing. Heavy green waterproof tarps had been securely strung between the massive mahogany trees to defeat aerial photography. Dozens of heavy wooden munitions crates sat neatly stacked underneath elaborate camouflage netting, demonstrating a highly organized and significant logistical effort by the entrenched enemy. The determined patrol leader and 1 designated lead scout silently prepared to move forward for the final close reconnaissance phase. Their physical movement out of the secure harbor position was glacially slow and utterly devoid of any mechanical friction. The American colonel quietly watched them slowly disappear into thin jungle shadows that should have been far too sparse to effectively conceal a full-grown man. They seemed to simply fade away into the muddy terrain, seamlessly becoming an organic part of the rotting vegetation, rather than separate human entities intruding upon the hostile, heavily guarded enemy environment. The 2 operators were gone inside the perimeter for a full hour, perhaps even longer as operational time severely warped under the extreme psychological stress. Time seemed to stretch infinitely during the agonizingly silent waiting period. The veteran colonel lay perfectly motionless in the mud with the other 4 SAS troopers, intensely watching the active staging area. He rigidly listened for any sudden, violent sign of enemy discovery or a panicked shouted alarm. Armed North Vietnamese guards routinely moved through the central clearing periodically, conducting their standard security sweeps around the massive stacks of hidden munitions. He could clearly observe 3 specific enemy guards walking in relaxed, predictable patterns that strongly suggested a casual routine rather than high-alert status. They moved quite casually through the humid clearing, occasionally smoking strong local cigarettes and talking quietly among themselves about trivial matters. They were clearly not expecting any lethal trouble this deep inside their own heavily fortified sovereign territory. The intoxicating, pungent smell of burning tobacco lazily drifted across the 50 meters of dense jungle, reaching the colonel's nostrils and serving as a terrifying sensory reminder of their extreme physical proximity to certain violent death. The 2 specialized SASR scouts eventually returned to the rally point, just as invisibly and silently as they had initially departed. One moment, the anxious American colonel was intensely watching a patch of seemingly empty jungle vegetation, and the very next moment the operators were simply there. They materialized out from the dark shadows and tangled vines like silent phantoms returning from the grave. They had successfully acquired everything the distant Allied headquarters desperately needed without firing a single shot. They brought back exact counts of the wooden crates and detailed manifests of the visible tactical supplies. Most of the hoarded equipment consisted of heavy mortar ammunition and critical medical supplies based on what the scouts had managed to observe closely. They also provided detailed mental sketches of the specific guard patrol patterns, troop numbers, and the precise physical layout of the defensive trench network. Crucially, they had secured photographic evidence utilizing a highly specialized, suppressed reconnaissance camera that emitted only the absolute faintest mechanical click during operation. They immediately began to extract from the danger zone utilizing the exact same excruciatingly slow, deliberate tactical movement techniques they had used to silently infiltrate it. There was absolutely no frantic rushing permitted, even though every single human instinct screamed at them to put massive distance between themselves and that heavily guarded staging area. The psychological friction of maintaining this incredibly slow pace while actively fleeing a known threat was immensely draining. By midday, they were finally far enough away from the target objective to safely risk moving at a slightly faster, more natural infantry pace. That late night, the critical intelligence they had gathered was swiftly radioed back to the distant Allied headquarters, utilizing a remarkably brief, highly compressed, encrypted transmission burst. The patrol leader utilized a specialized antenna thrown high into the jungle canopy to establish a momentary link, strictly minimizing their electronic signature. Every single transmission in this brutal environment was a massive tactical risk, an open invitation to be electronically triangulated and targeted by enemy hunter-killer teams. Therefore, they only broke their strict radio silence when they possessed actionable, strategic intelligence that could actively shape the broader war effort. The American colonel watched this disciplined communication process, noting the stark contrast with conventional American units that constantly chattered over unsecured tactical frequencies, constantly broadcasting their positions. Within exactly 2 days, the American colonel would later learn during a classified intelligence briefing that specific target area was completely obliterated. The hidden logistics hub was violently struck by a highly coordinated, devastating combination of heavy artillery barrages and concentrated tactical airstrikes. The entrenched enemy forces abruptly lost several weeks' worth of carefully stockpiled heavy ammunition and vital medical supplies in a massive series of secondary explosions. Subsequent hostile military operations in that entire geographical region were severely disrupted, and frontline enemy infantry units suddenly found themselves fighting Allied forces entirely without critical logistical support. This massive strategic victory was not achieved through a bloody, attritional infantry assault that would have inevitably cost dozens of young Allied lives. It was accomplished entirely because 6 highly trained men had possessed the supreme tactical patience to crawl close to the heavily armed enemy. They were disciplined enough to stay completely hidden in the suffocating mud, skilled enough to gather vital strategic information, and professional enough to extract silently. They had orchestrated massive destruction without ever being visually detected, proving that absolute silence in the jungle could be a weapon far deadlier than any machine gun. The seasoned colonel had spent his entire illustrious career thinking about military warfare almost exclusively in terms of decisive kinetic engagement and overwhelming firepower. The rigid American doctrine dictated that you aggressively find the enemy, physically fix him in place, and violently destroy him. However, surviving this grueling patrol alongside the Sazzer had fundamentally altered his professional perspective on the nature of armed conflict. He finally understood the immense value of deliberately avoiding contact to secure strategic knowledge, realizing that true tactical mastery often lay in the profound discipline of keeping your rifle completely silent in the dark. The exhausted patrol finally returned to the sprawling Nui Dat base on a deceptively quiet tropical morning, slipping seamlessly back through the razor wire like silent phantoms returning from the dense green underworld. There was absolutely no loud fanfare to greet them, no grand medals immediately awarded for their immense strategic success, and no eager reporters waiting to document their harrowing jungle ordeal. They were simply exhausted, filthy professionals returning from doing extraordinarily dangerous, grueling work in a highly controversial war that most of the divided world fundamentally misunderstood and desperately wanted to quickly forget. They quietly submitted to a rigorous intelligence debriefing, meticulously detailing every single tactical observation and ecological anomaly they had painstakingly recorded during the grueling patrol. Once the official military bureaucracy was fully satisfied, The filthy operators immediately began meticulously cleaning their specialized weaponry and heavily soiled combat gear, prioritizing the absolute readiness of their crucial equipment over their own desperate need for physical rest. The American colonel watched them execute this monotonous post-deployment maintenance with the exact same chilling, methodical focus they had displayed while lying completely motionless just meters away from armed enemy soldiers. Later that sweltering evening, the veteran American colonel sat quietly alone inside the stifling canvas mess tent, carefully writing detailed tactical observations in his battered olive-drab field journal. He was meticulously documenting specific fieldcraft techniques, sketching complex hand signals, and aggressively recording profound philosophical thoughts regarding absolute trust and unconventional unit leadership. He was actively writing about the immense, terrifying power of deliberate operational silence, realizing that complete invisibility was often vastly superior to calling in massive, indiscriminate artillery bombardments. He desperately wanted to permanently preserve these vital strategic lessons before his aging memory faded. The Australian patrol leader quietly entered the dimly lit canvas tent, silently pulling up a fragile folding chair next to the exhausted American officer. They sat together in a deeply comfortable shared silence for several long minutes, slowly drinking bitter, heavily boiled military coffee from dented tin cups, while surrounding conventional soldiers loudly complained about the miserable jungle heat. "Learn anything useful out there, sir?" the Australian finally asked in his characteristic low whisper, displaying absolutely no arrogant swagger or obnoxious need for external validation regarding his unit's undeniable, overwhelming tactical mastery of the harsh environment. Significantly more than I originally expected, the seasoned colonel honestly admitted, looking directly into the profoundly tired but highly alert eyes of the younger Australian soldier. "Your specialized patrol operates with a level of cold, calculating discipline that this veteran observer has never encountered before in over 2 decades of active infantry service." The patrol leader offered a very slight, weary smile in response. "We had excellent instructors, mainly British veterans who learned the bitter realities of brutal jungle warfare fighting vicious counterinsurgency campaigns in Malaya, and we subsequently adapted their hard lessons here. Your unique methods undeniably work," the American officer stated with absolute, unwavering conviction, reflecting on the massive enemy logistics hub they had successfully condemned to total fiery destruction without ever firing a single bullet. The stoic Australian slowly nodded in quiet agreement, his weathered face illuminated faintly by the flickering yellow light of a kerosene lantern swaying gently overhead. "It is a fundamentally different kind of war than most conventional military planners initially think, heavily relying on violently denying operational terrain to the enemy through constant, unseen surveillance rather than bleeding men to temporarily hold it. You absolutely cannot efficiently learn anything about the enemy's strategic intentions if you are constantly violently fighting them," the Australian sergeant continued softly, articulating the core operational philosophy of his elite regiment. The American colonel sat in silence, deeply processing the profound tactical truth embedded in that incredibly simple statement. His own conventional military culture aggressively emphasized the total authority of high rank, the rigid chain of command, and the absolute necessity of violently dominating the battlefield through the rapid, overwhelming application of massive kinetic firepower and heavily mechanized, large-scale troop movements across the country. However, operating deep behind hostile lines demanded an entirely different approach, one heavily reliant on implicitly trusting specialized operators to execute their specific tactical roles without constant, suffocating micromanagement from distant headquarters. "Your men are undeniably some of the absolute finest, most professional soldiers this aging officer has ever had the profound privilege to operate alongside," the colonel finally said, offering the highest praise he could possibly give. "They would genuinely appreciate hearing that," the patrol leader quietly replied, preparing to leave the stifling tent, but they would never actually admit it to anyone. Over the subsequent challenging months, the American colonel deliberately visited the elite Australian units several more times, aggressively absorbing everything he possibly could about their unconventional training methodologies and unique operational philosophy. He meticulously observed how they rigorously selected candidates for special operations, heavily prioritizing profound psychological resilience, rapid intellectual adaptability, and immense physical endurance over mere aggressive bravado. He carefully watched how they deliberately gave their men the essential tactical freedom to occasionally fail during incredibly brutal, highly realistic training exercises, ensuring they would absolutely never fail when real bullets were flying in combat. When he eventually returned to the United States to instruct ambitious young officers at the prestigious Military Staff College, he quietly incorporated these profound, hard-earned lessons into his advanced tactical curriculum. He frequently told gripping, can't sanitize stories about the immense tactical value of absolute silence, the critical importance of profound mutual trust within small reconnaissance teams, and the undeniable lethality of extreme operational patience. Some arrogant, traditionally minded officers fiercely resisted his unconventional teachings, stubbornly arguing that such passive, intelligence-gathering techniques simply did not practically apply to large-scale, high-intensity conventional warfare against mechanized armies. However, the highly perceptive military students truly understood the profound underlying message, gradually beginning to think radically differently about the critical application of small unit tactics and the immense strategic value of long-range reconnaissance. Meanwhile, that specific Australian patrol inevitably went right back out into the suffocating green hell of Phuoc Tuy province just 2 days after the American colonel had initially departed. 6 heavily armed men, carrying exceptionally light packs and wearing dark camouflage paint, silently vanished back into the unforgiving jungle shadows to aggressively gather more vital intelligence without ever being visually detected. Decades later, long after the bitter war had finally ended and the divided world had seemingly moved on, the aging colonel still occasionally opened his heavily worn, yellowing field journal to read those old notes. He would vividly remember the suffocating darkness of the pristine jungle, the terrifying proximity of the armed enemy, and the profound, chilling professionalism of those silent Australian soldiers. He kept those fragile pages until the very day he died, forever cherishing the underlined realization that the absolute best, most lethal soldiers are almost always the quietest ones in the chaotic room. Somewhere in rural Australia, a small group of aging, weathered men who had proudly served in that specific elite squadron still occasionally gathered together at the local pub to drink cold beer. If you ever ask them about the veteran American colonel who quietly accompanied their hazardous jungle patrol that one time, they will slowly nod with genuine, lingering respect. He was a very decent bloke, they will invariably say, noting that he kept his mouth completely shut, endured the immense physical pain without complaining, and simply watched the green jungle with the eyes of a true professional.